Hello Internet, welcome to part 8 of MERN full stack tutorial series. In last video, we implemented authentication. We coded for new user sign up functionality in register mutation. We hashed the password with bcrypt package. We implemented login functionality and returned JSON web token as return value after successful login. We also returned proper error messages for different error conditions during sign up and login functionality. On MongoDB, we implemented a unique index on email field. So let's start by implementing a functionality to get current logged in user in this video. So I have created video 8 branch and the Express server is running. We have connected to MongoDB also. So in GraphQL server instantiation, we have passed in this typedef, resolvers, and context. So this context currently is a static object. Instead of that, we can also define a arrow function which returns an object like so. So after this, we need to get a current logged in user. So we can, the typical convention is to use me keyword. So this me will retrieve or it signifies the current logged in user information. So for that we need to create a function uh, called, let's call it get current user, and let's pass in some arguments to this arrow function in context, and let's pass the same arguments to me, the get current user function. So now we need to define this function get current user, and it has some arguments. So for time being, let's just console log and args. So what is the current setup is we have Express server running. It is listening to this port, and we applied the GraphQL server via this apply middleware function. So let's run it again. There seems to be a typo. Okay, so there was an extra comma here. So let's restart the server. Let's save it. Okay, so now the Express server is up. So what we are doing is in the context, we defined an arrow function and we are expecting some arguments and which we are passing, and simply we are logging here. So on the browser, let's go to our GraphQL endpoint. Okay, so let's just close the GraphQL server for now. So now we see we are getting these arguments printed on the console. So let's just expand a little bit. So this response is basically the two objects which the Express server gets. So this is request and response. We will get request and response object access to the Express server, and that is what is passed as arguments. So when we started the GraphQL server, GraphQL endpoint, that fired up the queries and the express is listening to that port, and that's how we get access to this request and response. So what we can do now is, instead, what we are interested in the arguments is the request part. So let's just pass in the request, and let's call this request here. So now, in instead of console logging the args, we can console log the request. And in the request header, we also request we will get access to the headers. Let's just console log the headers from this request. Let's again go to the GraphQL endpoint. Okay, now we see all these headers from this request: the host, connection, accept. So all these are the default headers which the GraphQL endpoints attaches to every request. So what we can do now is, on the headers on this GraphQL query, we can define our own headers for each of the mutations which we run. For example, if I on the GraphQL playground, I'm on this HTTP headers. Remember, we used the query variables in prior mutations. So similarly, we can use this HTTP headers, and let's say XAuth token and uh, GraphQL token. It should be in double quotes. Okay, so now we have defined this HTTP header. The key value pair is this XAuth token, and we are just passing in this GraphQL token here. And on the VS Code, let's get access to the XAuth token. So we are not interested in all the header parts, but what we are interested in is the specific header key value pair which we defined. So let's just save it here. So now this HTTP header we have defined as GraphQL token, we have access to that now here. Every request from this GraphQL is getting this XAuth token. For example, if I just delete it, see, we don't have this GraphQL token access anymore. It is now undefined. So we can use this GraphQL token, and which is the JSON Web Token. And if the client sends that JSON Web Token, we should be able to extract the payload which is used to create the JSON Web Token. So for that, the JWT or JSON Web Token package gives us a functionality, another function. So before that, in this index, let's require JSON Web Token. As usual, let's call this JWT. So now in the get user function, let's call this request.headers constant token is equal to this. So if we have a token, that is if it is not null, then what we can run is jwt dot verify. Remember jwt dot sign we used to create the JSON Web Token based on a payload. So JSON jwt dot verify will decipher the payload from the token. So we need to pass in the token as first argument. The second argument is the secret code which we used to create the JSON Web Token. So if you remember from last video, we defined that in environment variable. So let's extract the same secret here. Let's call it current user. Then just console.log current user, and also let's return it. Okay, so now our code is running. So first we need to log in. So we need to log in to get this token. Okay, so we got this new token. Let's just copy this, and we defined xauth token, and let's paste this token we got when we logged in. And if you see here in the VS Code, we are getting the ID for that user, and that user is email. So if you, again, the payload we used to create the JSON Web Token was user ID and email. And the two other fields what we are getting is when this was created and till what time this JSON Web Token is valid for. So in the JSON Web Token, we created this in the user resolver. I think we set up this 1 day expiration date. So that's what this field, this expire set gives the timestamp. So now we have access to this object, which is current logged in user's ID and email in me key of context. So now for all mutations and resolver queries, we have access to the current logged in user as third positional argument in third positional arguments. So there we can do the check if the user is logged in, if it is a valid user, and take appropriate decisions. When user registers, we are just asking for email and password, and their display name will be defaulted to their email. It would be nice to give a functionality to user to update their display name. So let's try implementing that. So here on the user type def, we had defined the mutation, register, and login. Let's define another mutation called update display name. and its input will be display name input. And after modification of the user type, we should get user back, the updated user. Now that means once the update, once this mutation is run, we will get this type with ID, email, password. Okay. I think we made an error here. Of course, we need to have password saved in database, but the password shouldn't be exposed to the front end. It has no business of being here in this type def. So let's remove the password from user type. So it will expose ID, email, name, and avatar, books owned, and books borrowed. So now we need to define this input type. Input display name input. It will have just a string. It should be a string and it cannot be null. So that takes care of user type def, the schema part of GraphQL. Now let's go to the models. This is the this is the MongoDB uh, schema in Mongoose. So we had just defined two fields, email and password. Let's now define name as string. Let's also save it. Now, on the user resolver file, we had defined the resolvers for this mutation, register and login. So right after the login, within the mutation, let's define update display name resolvers. So again, it will be a async function. We are talking about database, then parent, which we will not use here, and then we'll extract or deconstruct the input. Then we need, similar to login and registration, we need user collection, and we have access to me. So let's implement the try catch block. Throw new error. So first, let's console log me. Why we need access to me is we are updating the display name of a user. So obviously when that can be done is when user is logged in and the session is valid, then only we should allow this operation to happen. If the user is not logged in or if the session is terminated or session is timed out, then we should not allow this operation to succeed and make any changes to the database. So that's why we need access to this me object we implemented just now. So let's save it. Okay, so connected to MongoDB. Let's go to our GraphQL. And here we have defined this mutation of login. Let's just comment it out. Let's not delete these mutations and queries. We will need them when we create UI. So here we need an input type. What did we define this as? Display name input. This is of type display name input, and we need to run this update name display. Okay, so on the query variables, we need to define name. Let's just delete this, and then name is, say, power user. And we have also given this auth token. So just remove that for now. And let's see, let's run this query. Okay, so the query is not complete because we need to get what, because we returned the user. So we need to define what values to display here after we fire the query. So let's say we want to display name. Okay. So now we are getting an error of null. That is because we have not implemented the user. However, when we see it on the console, we are seeing this undefined. Me is undefined because we have not logged in. Now let's log in to get the JSON web token. So we got the JSON web token. Let's copy it here. Let's go to HTTP headers and define XAuth token and paste this web token, JSON web token. And for query variables, we need to give the input type, display input type. So let's uncomment the display name input mutation. Okay. So now if we go to the VS Code, now we get this user object, the email ID and ID. So let's use that to update the user. So first thing what we need to define is if me is not defined, then we need to throw an error. The error message is login to update display name. Now we have access to the logged in user and we pass that check of logged in user is valid. At this point, let's update the user. So for that, on user collection, we can use find one and update function. So find one and update, it will, the first flag it takes is the matching criteria. So the matching criteria what we are going to use is this underscore ID should be equal to me.id. The second object is what update we are going to make. Here it is set operation. We are setting the name to input.name value which is passed, and the third flag is new is equal to true. So the whole operation is async. So let's use await, and the return value is updated user. So let's return this updated user after this function. So what is happening here is we got the logged in user. We are running this find one and update method where we are matching the document in MongoDB by ID equal to me.id, and we are setting the name field to input.name. Let's run it. So before that, I want to see on MongoDB the current values. So in the second terminal, I have I'm connected to Atlas. So let's run db collections.find. So we are using this p3.test. So here the name field is not there because we didn't define it. So now let's go to the playground. Let's run the mutation update name. We are saying it's power user as the name, and then run it. So we got the successful message. We are extracting only name, and here on the MongoDB we see the power user is been updated. So let's try just updating it one more time to power user 123. It's updated to power user 123. Okay, so the name is updated to power user 123, and equally important, the other users P1, P2 and P user which we had created are not modified. Let's try one more negative test of running this query without logging in. So on playground, let's remove this token and try running this. So we are getting login to update the display name. So this is what we coded in VS Code. So that takes care of update display name mutation. And we said that in the beginning, when we register, our name will be equal to the email name. The display should be equal to email name. So let's update that in register mutation. Name is also equal to input.email. So by default, the display name will be equal to email, and if user chooses to update it, they can use this update display name mutation via front end. So far, we've been using the terminal to connect to MongoDB via Mongo shell. Definitely, this is one way to do it. The another way, if you would like, is go to this extensions and search for Atlas for MongoDB, that is MongoDB for VS Code, and we can simply click install. I have installed this here, and once it is installed, we see this MongoDB icon. After that, we need to create a connection. So the create connection is pretty simple. Here we can connect with this option, connect with a string. So this is the same string we get it on the MongoDB Atlas, and the connection string we put it MongoDB URI as MongoDB URI in environment variable .env file. So the same connection string with ID and password can be given here. Once it is connected, this this is how it will look like. So we see the cluster, the databases. So here in the database we have user collections. So in user collections we entered 4 documents, so all of them are displayed by their ID. So we can just click on it to see the ID and password, all the elements of that. So we can view the document if you'd like in this fashion. And also there is this create new playground. So they have given the templates of queries. So similar to how we use the terminal, this playground will help in firing the queries and make connection to MongoDB Atlas. So in this video, we completed the authorization and completing the authentication authorization loop. So a logged in user is allowed or authorized to update the display name, and that is what is implemented in this video. In last video we implemented authentication, allowing or validating the logged in user. That's wrap for this video. In next we will continue to implement other functionalities of book club project.